Hey everybody, it's Hank. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for subscribing to the podcast. Don't forget you can find all of the archives at hankgarner.com, also on YouTube and Stitcher Radio. Links to all of those are in the show notes. Also, this week, my short story writer's block, which is in the Weston Files series, is free. So please go pick up a copy of it, and I would really appreciate it. Also, we have a new Patreon account, and if you like the show and you've gotten some benefit from it or gotten some motivation from the show or encouragement, please consider going over and pledging just $1 per show or whatever you can do. It would really help, and we appreciate it. Now on to the interview.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. This is your host, Hank Garner, and as always, you can find all of the archives of the podcast at hankgarner.com. And I invite you to go to the website, browse through the archives of the podcast, look for Kindle deals that we feature on there quite often, and browse around and find some great books to read. I'm very excited to have on the podcast with me this week Daryl Gregory, and Daryl brings a great mix to the podcast this week because Daryl, like so many other authors that I interview, is a short story writer, a novel writer, but also writes comics. Anybody that listens to the show knows that I'm a big comics geek and was really excited when a friend of the show, Nancy Kress, recommended that I contact Daryl. So welcome to the show, Daryl.
Oh, thanks for having me, Hank. I appreciate it.
Super excited to have you on this week, like I said. And I want to get started this week. Each week I have some variation of the same question. And I want you to tell the audience, how did you know that you wanted to become a writer? What was that first memory or inclination that you said, you know what, I think I want to do this thing?
It had to be the Kmart paperback rack. So there was this Kmart in my house, and my mom worked there when I was a kid, and we would go to Kmart all the time, and sometimes we'd go when my mom was working and bother her. But every time we went, my parents would let me go to the paperback rack. And every time I showed up to the checkout aisle with another science fiction paperback, they would buy it for me, which was just fantastic because they didn't know what to do with their geek son, but they supported me nonetheless. And from day one, I don't remember not wanting to be a writer. I remember just reading these books and wanting to do that thing that they were doing to my head. Just from the start, like it just seems inseparable for me. The reading and then wanting to write, starting with novels. You know, my first novel was this 12-page epic in 5th grade that I'm still very proud of. That featured G.I. Joe, Sherlock Holmes, and a couple other people meeting in time to have an adventure with this kid who built a crystal radio. Still, why haven't I built another novel about this? So for me, it was right from the start. I just wanted desperately. I wanted to be on that science fiction paperback rack. I didn't want hardcovers. I didn't know anyone bought hardcovers. I thought those were only in libraries. I just wanted a really gaudy cover on a Kmart paperback rack. That's all I wanted.
So that was success to you.
Yes, and I still have not made it onto a paperback rack in a Target or a Kmart or a Walmart. So my dream is still unfulfilled.
Well, here's to one day, right?
One day, please.
I have I've often wondered about that because when I was a kid, I also fell in love with books, started with comics and then to other more serious books. But my natural inclination was I love this thing so much, I want to do this. And I've talked to other people that are musicians, especially and they'll meet someone who is a huge audiophile and who loves music, but that person that they meet may not have any desire to be a musician and to create music on their own, and these musicians, it just blows their mind. It's like, how can you love music and not want to create it yourself?
Right.
But I think there's this kind of I think the rest of the world looks at us as weird that well, of course I can love something and not want to create it, and the rest of us are like, no, you can't.
Oh yeah, I love music, but I know I suck at it. I took guitar lessons for years, and I only learned to be awful. So writing for me was the thing that I wanted to do, and I was just good enough at it to want to be better. And now I tell people that the reason I write is because it's the thing I do well. It's the hardest thing I know how to do well. So if it was really easy, I probably wouldn't be interested. But it's really hard. It's really difficult. And you learn just enough everything you write to want to get a little better. And so that's what keeps me in it.
So what was your first, so you wrote the epic novel in the film, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And did you have anyone in your life that encouraged you down this path? Did you, maybe a teacher, anything like that saw a spark in you and said, you know what, you need to pursue this? Was there anyone like that? There were teachers who were really supportive and let me write stuff. Like they let me publish that long science fiction story in the school newspaper, the Rambler Roundup at Burning Hills Elementary School. They let me, Mr. Krause let me publish that thing. That was my first published story. So there were at every step of the way, there was some teacher who let me do my weird stuff and encouraged me from elementary school to middle school to high school. I just had great teachers who were and my parents, like I said, they didn't know quite why I wanted to haul a typewriter with me on vacation every year, but they let me do it. It's just I was very lucky that I never had one person say, this is ridiculous, you need to stop this. Never at any point. So I feel really lucky. So you actually hauled a typewriter with you on vacation?
Yeah, and barely used it. Like, I can't believe, my dad is trying to fit all the stuff in the trunk of our Ford LTD, and I'm putting a typewriter in. And he gives me this look, like, really? You have to put in the typewriter? And I'm like, I need to write. And then I wouldn't write. I'd just be hanging out on the beach reading. But he let me bring that typewriter over and over again. God bless him.
And they're thinking, wow, what a pretentious kid.
I know, right? If only I could be chain-smoking candy cigarettes while over my typewriter. That would have been perfect.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So your bio on your website says that you write software during the day, novels in the evening, and then comics at night.
Yeah.
I've had an inordinate amount of guests on the show whose day job is something anchored in IT. Tell me a little bit about how you went down that path and kind of how that paralleled your writing, and did you decide that you needed to find a career to support your writing? Did you leave writing for a while? Just kind of give me a little bit of that history.
Yeah, I needed a career to support the family and put food on the table. So
yeah, that's a lot of our stories, by the way.
So the way it worked for me was I was an English major and a theater major double, which makes me twice as unemployable as the usual liberal arts major.
Right.
And I was an English teacher for 3 years, and I did a year in Salt Lake City where I was training people how to use phone systems of all things. And then we came to Pennsylvania, and I started working for this little software company as a technical writer. And then I started doing marketing writing. And then at some point, someone invented the web. And they said, well, we have to put our newsletters, our corporate newsletters, up on this thing called the Internet. And I was a geek in that I'd always liked computers. I'd always done a little programming. I used to hang around. This will age me. This will set my age. I would hang around the Radio Shack playing with TRS-80s, loading programs on cassette tapes. That's how the Yeah, baby.
Oh, yeah. I had a TRS-80 color computer too.
Oh, you had the color.
Oh yeah, the Coco 2, and then had the RAM expansion with the cassette recorder, and then I begged my mother one year for my birthday to get me the floppy disk drive to go for it. Oh yeah, but before that, it was my friends and I would spend an entire weekend typing in code for some program that we found, and it'd take all weekend to type it in, and then play a game for an hour, and then you switch the machine off, and it's gone forever. But anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just had to share that piece of nostalgia.
No, those are such people. I don't know why these guys in Radio Shack. I didn't even own it. They would let me and my friends hang around the Radio Shack for hours, playing with these trash 80s.
Yeah. I actually worked at Radio Shack. I worked my way through college working at Radio Shack after that, and I had the same experience. Like, there were these weird guys that worked there that let me hang out and do all this stupid stuff, and so I tried to pay the favor back, and I think it comes down to it's like the drug dealer. The first taste is free, and then you have to keep coming back and buying stuff. But anyway, I'm sorry.
No, it was great. So, I'd always been a geek, and I'd always played around with computers. And so I had that mindset when they invented the internet. So I did everything on the website. I coded the HTML and did the graphics and wrote the copy, and it was beautiful to be able to do everything. And then over time, my job became less content creation at work and more programming. Right now I'm mostly a .NET programmer, doing stuff on the back end with a lot of databases and that kind of thing. And it's fun, and that's why I do half-time. So I work in the mornings for the software company still, where I've been for close to 25 years. And I work for them in the mornings, and then in the afternoons I go off to a coffee shop and I write fiction, and I try to squeeze in comic books when I can.
Nice. So, tell me about the first story that you seriously considered. Okay, this is me being a serious writer, and I'm going to craft this thing, and I'm going to get it published. Kind of, where did that come from? You said you were an English major, so
Right.
when you left high school, did you say, okay, I've always been this writer, this is what I'm going to pursue?
Oh yeah, I was pretentious as hell. So I would, and I would write like one story a year, or take a creative writing course so I could write 3 short stories in a year, and they were all pretty terrible. But I wrote. I kept writing, and then after but nothing ever got published. I never even really submitted anything. But I became an English teacher, and I was working in this. I was living in East Lansing, Michigan, which is the home of Michigan State, and Clarion, the science fiction and fantasy writing workshop, took place in Michigan State in East Lansing, and I submitted there, and they accepted me, and that was just an eye-opening experience because I submitted everything I'd written, all 3 stories I could finish. One of them I wrote specifically to be admitted, and I wrote them to get into Clarion, and it was so great to. Well, I liken it to alligator wrestling. It's like you grow up thinking, wow, I really admire alligator wrestlers, but you grow up in a town with no alligators and no swamp, and you've seen it on TV, but you don't know how it's supposed to work. And then you can go to this class. You go to this workshop that lasts for 6 weeks where you meet real alligator wrestlers, and they give you an alligator to wrestle, and you get to critique each other's alligator wrestling technique. It was fantastic, and it just made all of a sudden this kind of pipe dream that I had about writing all of a sudden became possible. I'd met writers. I was taught by writers. I met a peer group of people who all wanted the same thing I did, and it was just amazing. And so one of the stories I wrote at Clarion became my first sale in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And from that moment, I was hooked because I realized I could do it. I've been published in a national magazine, so therefore everything was possible, which was ridiculous, but that's how I felt. It's like, now I can do this thing. They have to let me keep doing it.
So it was just that little bit of validation that you needed, and that was it.
Yeah. People say don't go to Clarion or don't go to these workshops expecting validation, but that's what I needed. I needed someone to say, no, this is not crazy. And among this peer group, you fit in, and you're going to go ahead and you're allowed to go do this thing now. It's almost like I needed permission to go ahead and do this.
And I think there are there are tons of alternatives to that nowadays with the internet. There's all sorts of communities that you can fit in, but those workshops are phenomenal, and you're absolutely right. It is a solitary thing, this writing, but when you connect with other people and call it what you will, but there really is something that happens when you get that feedback from other people, and the confidence grows, and it really is something that changes in a writer.
Oh yeah, it changed me, and you're right about it being a solitary activity. I mean, science fiction conventions are weird things. It's like a bunch of hermit crabs decided to all meet together. Let's take all the introverts and we'll all huddle together in a hotel bar, and that will be our convention. It's a weird thing.
That is a weird thing. So what happened after that first story? Where did you go from there?
Oh, well, it was a skyrocket to nowhere. So what I did, I wrote, I got about 3 stories published, and then I disappeared. My wife at the time was getting tenure as a professor. We were raising kids. I was working full time at that software company by that point, and I would write. I would try to write. I'd be so exhausted, but I would try to get some writing done. So I would write for a couple hours every week. That's about all I could manage. And I worked on this completely unpublishable long science fiction novel that never went anywhere. The fact that I could cut it up into separate short stories, and each of these short stories have nothing to do with each other, tells you the problem with the novel.
Ouch.
Yeah, I know. But it was a great. I mean, I had to go through it to learn it, and so then later, I was like, I need to get serious about writing, and our kids were older, and we could do this thing. And I switched to half-time at the day job, and that's when I got serious, and that's when I could put in enough hours into this thing to get better, because it just takes time. It just takes so much time to learn how to write badly, and then eventually learn how to write well.
And there's something soul-crushing about someone who has stories inside of them and knows that I should be doing this, but I just can't squeeze it in. There's something very demoralizing about being in that place.
Oh yeah, and especially, I mean, the way the United States is set up, it's like you just need insurance. You need this stuff. So somebody was talking about, like, well, how come there seems to be this wave of British writers? And somebody said they have national health insurance. Like, you could survive as a writer in a way that it's really hard in the United States. So I know very few writers who can start out writing full time without having a spouse or a partner who's providing some kind of financial input. So that's why I'm still working half time as a programmer. It's just you can get these contracts for novels, and you get a little chunk of money, but that's not steady. Like you feel like you can't bank on it. So it's not providing health insurance. So I still keep the day job.
Yeah, I never really thought of that the way you just put it, but you're right. That we really have a broken system. It's crazy.
Well, it's hard to be an entrepreneur. I think there's tons of entrepreneurs who could probably better afford to go off on their own if it wasn't for this huge weight of insurance. You're just going out naked without it.
You're right. So what brought you out of that funk? You said you had this novel that was kind of a behemoth and it really didn't work. How did you come out of that and make your way to your next successful project?
Well, I thank God that science fiction has a short story market. Because what brought me back was writing short stories again. I was making time for short stories. And then, so after a huge long break, I started writing again and publishing again. And the weird thing is, in that long break where I was writing an unpublishable novel, but really barely spending any time on it, something had happened. I don't know if it was raising kids. I don't know if it was just time. But by the time I came back to short stories, I figured out, I changed my mind about what kind of writer I wanted to be and what kind of stories I wanted to write. I'd figured out an angle of attack for these short stories, and it was a very limited. It was it was like a reality first kind of fiction where I was concentrating very much on character and making these people as real as possible and letting the fantastic fill itself in around it. And that became sort of my guiding light for a while. And thank goodness there were short stories, because I could figure out how to write that way in these markets. And then I started publishing short stories again, and I just abandoned that first novel. Enough time had passed where I could give it up and stop trying to fix that broken thing. And I could start on the book that became my first novel, which is called Pandemonium. And it was a whole different way of thinking about a book. And so that's what got me out of that funk. I think it was the time away and then getting a chance to have that part-time job so I could restart again and rethink what I was doing.
That's a great point, and something I've been pondering a lot lately, and you just summed it up better than I've been able to. I haven't quite been able to put my finger on it. But I am a huge fan of science fiction and fantasy. And sometimes you open up a book and you get into it and you're just immersed in the story, and sometimes you're not. And one thing that I've noticed is that, I'll start a ton of books and never finish them. And when you, especially in fantasy, for some reason you've got people think that they need to build this world and need to tell you all the minutia of the world. But if you can do all the world building that you want, but if there's not a Frodo or a Gandalf there to make you care about, then who cares about the world? You've got to have characters in there that grab you, that grab your heart, that pull you into the story and make you care about them and their plight. And that's awesome that you discovered that and that started your upward trajectory. That's fascinating.
Yeah, like the big change in I started thinking about so I was a theater double major, and I had this acting teacher who said his phrase was, "You can't play running from a bear," and what he meant was you can't just run from a bear. If you're on stage and you're an actor, you have to be running toward something. So if you're being chased by a bear, you could be running toward a shotgun or toward the door of the house or to a tree, but you have an immediate goal that's in front of you. And once I realized that was really the secret, that every point I was stuck with a story, it's usually because I didn't understand what the character wanted, what they wanted in that moment, what they wanted in that scene. what they wanted over the entire length of the story. And that became the thing that really saved me in every point. Because I'd write these long, meandering stories where nothing was really happening, and they just failed completely. And so, for me, character is plot, and plot is character. And it's characters trying to achieve their goals moment by moment. And if I can figure that out, then I've got a story, and I've got something with heart. And you're right, the world building has to come around that and be meshed with it. It's not this thing. I'm not a person who builds a world first and then tries to find characters fitting into it. Whenever I'm thinking of a story, it's like characters and the world are hand in hand. I've only got a world if I've got a character moving through it. Otherwise, it's kind of dead to me.
Right. So what is Pandemonium? What's the story about?
Oh, so Pandemonium is it's a story about a guy who was possessed when he was 5 years old by this demon called the Hellion. But in this world, people get possessed all the time, and nobody knows if it's a neurological problem or if it's a disease or if it's actually something magical. And when he's about 27 years old, the thing that he thought he got rid of when he was 5 seems to be coming back. And so he's trying to figure out how he gets rid of this thing that's inside him. And what I was really interested in was this guy who is basically on a quest, and he doesn't know whether he's in a science fiction novel or a fantasy novel. Like, he doesn't know whether the explanation is going to be something with psionics, something with... He doesn't know if he's in a fantasy novel. He doesn't know if he's in a straight science fiction novel where this is a disease. So he's checking with neurologists. He's checking with exorcists. He's checking with everybody, trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And I was really interested in this idea that not only would the character not know what kind of novel he was, but the reader wouldn't know either. And I didn't want the reader to be able to set a set a foot down and know exactly where they stood. I like that kind of destabilized feeling of you're not sure how the world works.
And Pandemonium has a great cover too. It's really unsettling and kind of provocative.
Yeah, that was a great idea by my editor, Fleetwood Robbins. He was my editor at Del Rey, and it's just this painting of a farmhouse, and then you see the hand that's painting the farmhouse, and he's filling in the word pandemonium, and demon is being filled in red. And what I loved about it was the kind of, a lot of it does take place in the heartland of the United States, and this idea of this bucolic kind of cover with the word demon being filled in.
Right.
Just loved it.
How long did it take you to write Pandemonium?
It took me probably 2 years, because it took a year of thinking about it and trying to figure out how to write the novel and outlining it and trying. Because the other thing I'd figured out by writing short stories badly was that I needed to know where it ended before I began. I would always rush into stories, and I wouldn't know where they were going, and I would immediately paint myself into a corner. I realized I didn't even have a story. I had a thing that went nowhere. And so I learned to have to wait to figure out what the ending of the story was. And once I knew what the start was, and once I knew what the end was, I didn't have to worry about the middle so much. I could start the book then. And so it took a lot of thinking before I actually wrote a word. And then I think I wrote it and rewrote it. And probably about 2 years, and then there was another year of trying to sell it and having it sit on agents' desks and sitting on editors' desks for a long time.
Now, are you a plotter or a pantser? I know you said that you need to kind of get your head around the story before you start, but how deeply do you plan out your novel before you start?
Yeah. It really varies. So yeah, I'm a plotter when it comes to the beginning and the end, and really a pantser in the middle. Though I like to have the major tent poles in the plot sort of set out there, so I can aim for them. Like, I'll know where, if there's a major twist, I will aim for that, and then once I get to that, I pivot the novel to the next goal for the characters. So it's
kind of a hybrid.
Right. I like the structure, but I like the pantsing. I like the effect of discovering stuff while I'm writing that first draft that I love so much. And so the main I guess process I use is the afterline, which is I have a really sketchy outline and I fill in the outline as I go with more detail so that I know where I've been and maybe where I need to move things around. And I keep telling myself the story over and over again to figure out if I'm still on the beam, if I'm still telling the story that I want to tell, and if I'm not, is there a better story that I've discovered while I'm writing, and I re-outline, and I stop right there and I re-outline the thing to figure out if there's a better story that I could be telling.
I've met a few writers that are die-hard, detailed plotters. But I think the majority of writers that I've met are like you. We like to, of course, know where the story begins. We like to know where we're headed with the story, and we kind of like these signposts along the way. But even though you have a map that says I'm going to start in Chicago and I'm going to end in Seattle, there's a lot of things that happen along the way that you can't see on that map. And I think that's a great way for writers to hold on to their creative integrity, if you want to call it that, while also being fastidious in their, using their time wisely.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act, and usually I can find out halfway through the novel that I'm not really heading to Seattle. I really need to go to San Diego,
right?
And that's okay. And I think every other writer's process is appalling to other writers. So the main thing, and Cat Rambo has said this repeatedly, which is try lots of things, find the thing that works, and do that lots. And that's really the thing. It's like there are all kinds of styles of writers, and whatever gets the work done, whatever works, is the thing that you should use.
Yeah. So what came next after Pandemonium?
After Pandemonium was a book called Devil's Alphabet. I'd sold a 2-book contract to Del Rey, and I signed it, and I had finished Pandemonium, and I was like, oh my God, I don't have a second novel idea. I think I've used every idea I've ever had in Pandemonium. So I started with a weird image of a guy who was about 12 feet tall by the side of the road with chalk white skin working on his pickup, and I had no idea what that guy was doing. I knew it had something to do with some sort of genetic disorder. And from there, I started trying to figure out what the story was, and then I set it near where my parents grew up in eastern Tennessee. And once I had the location and I had that character, then the rest of the novel started filling in. And that's really a book that's written, out of desperation. And so that was the second book, and then the third book for Del Rey was Raising Stony Mayhaw, which was it's like an anti-zombie novel. I wanted to write a literary zombie novel, which is a terrible idea, because people who really like zombie novels are probably not interested in a literary novel, and people reading literary novels are not interested in a zombie novel. And the sales reflected that. And also it had a terrible cover. And I say that because my editor at the time has said, yeah, it was a terrible cover. We should have had a better cover. But that, so those 3 novels where I wrote for Del Rey, and I don't know what to say. Like, every novel I tried to figure out something I'd never done before, something that I just didn't have the tools for, because that what sort of kept me interested. And with Stony Mayhaw, I'd never written a novel about an entire life before, from birth to death. So I started when the character's a baby and ended when they died. As much as you can say a zombie ever is born or ever dies. But it was all because I wanted to see if I could write something with that kind of scope.
Do stories with a supernatural thriller element, do those things appeal to you? It seems like your books tend to kind of lean into that territory.
Yeah, I would have thought, I would have described myself as a science fiction writer first. And most of my short stories, for example, have a lot to do with neuroscience and hard science. And my novel After Party, which came after Stony, is pretty much a straight-ahead, hard SF novel about 3D printing designer drugs. It's about religion and neuroscience and the nature of consciousness and free will. Pretty hard SF.
Yeah.
But I keep returning to the horrific, the supernatural, and I'm really interested in this idea of writing supernatural novels that are that have a real, almost scientific point of view. Like in Stony Mayhall, the main character is a zombie, and he knows, because he has a scientific mindset, that his own existence makes no sense. Like, how could a dead thing be thinking and have a metabolism? And this haunts him his entire life. And he keeps trying to do experiments to figure out, to get to the bottom of it. But the physics of his world make no sense. But he keeps trying. And so John Clute actually called it, he goes, like, this is a science fiction novel. It's about a zombie. The physics make no sense. But the approach to it, just like with Pandemonium, where he didn't know if he was in a science fiction novel or not, the approach that appeals to me is being a science fiction writer. And I like science fiction novels set with alternate physics that have to do with the impossible.
Yeah. Well, with the questions that raises with Stony Mayhall, how can something be dead yet have consciousness? But it sounds like also the types of questions that are raised in After Party are these hard SF topics and questions, but also the big questions about life in the universe and about the deep philosophical things. And I think that's what good science fiction should do, is to make us think about these things and to get us to look at these from a different angle.
Right. I'm just haunted by every single novel I've written has something to do with identity and trying to figure out, what do we mean by the self? So I one of my earlier stories is called Second Person Present Tense. And it's about this problem that neuroscientists came across where the conscious decision to do something like raise your finger or do something simple, the conscious thought happened after the brain was warming up and after the brain had sent the nerve impulse down to the hand to start moving. There was a gap of 500 milliseconds. So this raises all kinds of issues about free will and consciousness. If the conscious decision to raise your finger is happening after the fact, that we can monitor your body and know that before you have the thought, your body, the back brain, had already made the decision, had already sent the signal down the arm and it was traveling toward your finger, then we know that consciousness is kind of an illusion, a really convincing one, and one we all feel comfortable with, but it's nevertheless an illusion. And this idea that the self is this construct and that free will itself, if you follow the same logic that neuroscientists have laid out for us, free will gets kind of impossible as well in the traditional sense that we think of free will. And these kind of philosophical questions just drive almost every story I've written.
And you talked about writing in second person present. That can be very jarring for readers sometimes who are not used to that perspective. What is it like writing from that perspective?
Yeah, so the title of the story is actually second person present tense, because the plot of the story is that there's a person who is the second person in this body, and they have all the memories of the girl who was there before,
Nice.
and they know exactly what happened, but they are not that person. They don't own those memories, and this girl. These parents come to pick her up at the hospital after she's overdosed on this drug that has caused this cognitive fracture. And she knows who these people are. She knows that they're the parents of the girl who used to be in this body, but they're not her parents. And so most of the story is actually written conventionally in third person. First person. But there is a section actually written in second person where it says you are the person in your body, and who is this you that you are in this moment? And is this a momentary self, or is this a permanent self? So that's what that story was about. But I do like writing. This is the great thing about some tricks that you can do in prose that might have been harder in, let's say, comics or in a movie script, which is to use language to make experience strange and to make people think about even the pronouns you use. What does that say about the self? Like, how are you actually thinking of yourself? And who is the you and who is I? I always think of there was a line by a comedian who said, I used to think the brain was the most important organ in the body until I realized who was telling me that. Yeah, and so there's always a split between the mind and the brain and the self that I find really interesting.
Wow. Tell me about We Are All Completely Fine.
Now, there's a game with pronouns as well. So it's called We Are All Completely Fine, and the pronoun game in there is that the narrator is first person plural. So every chapter starts with we. We are in this group, and so it's about a small group therapy, a therapy group for people who have survived supernatural encounters. Because I was thinking of all those people who are the final girls or the soul survivors at the end of one of these horror movies. I always thought, boy, I bet they need a lot of therapy afterward. So what if they were all in therapy together? And they were all in small group together. So we've got the survivor of a 70s cannibal family. We've got the survivor of an 80s slasher flick. We've got the survivor of a Cthulhu kind of adventure, and so on. And these people are all in therapy together. And I do this thing where the hero of the novel, the protagonist of the novel, is the group. They're trying to come together as a group, and so the chapters start with we, but then pick up one of the person's story from the group. And in the next chapter, we'll start with we again and move into another person's story. And by the end, all their stories are overlapping because, of course, they figure out that not only are their horror stories related to each other, but they're not finished yet. And that novella, it just won the Shirley Jackson Award. It's been up for some other awards. It's up for the World Fantasy Award. And it's being adapted by the Sci-Fi Channel. The pilot was being written by Wes Craven until he died 2 weeks ago.
That's what I was going to ask you about that. Man, I read a press release about it, and I was like, oh, that's amazing, except Wes just died.
Yeah, I know, right?
Man.
But Sci-Fi Channel says they're going ahead, and they found a new writer, and they're going ahead with Wes's production company is going to still be doing it. So that's great, but you feel terrible saying, here's a guy who died of brain cancer, and your second thought is, wait, what about my show?
Right, or did I kill him?
Yeah. Well, I did have a friend call me Craven Slayer, and I'm like, that's not fair.
That's not fair.
That's
It's
not
like,
fair.
yeah, he was writing your story. Coincidence? Yeah. And seriously, condolences to Wes's family. But that's what. What is that feeling like when the story that you've written gets that sort of attention? That not only is this going to be adapted for television, but to have someone as high profile as Wes Craven attached to it.
Well, I mean, that's the mind-blowing part. The fact that Wes Craven read my book and liked it well enough that he was going to start working on it and direct the pilot and be a producer, that's kind of crazy. That's fantastic. Now, the thing is that everything could go south at any moment, and there's lots of these kind of deals that fall apart. This could still fall apart at any point.
Of course.
Yeah, and so I try to dampen my enthusiasm, but the part that is not dampened is that you've just hit on, which is it's pretty great that someone whose work I admire so much, who like in Scream, basically reinvented the genre that he created, and the modern horror movie, and so I'm that was pretty great. And if it turns out no show ever gets made, I at least know that before Wes died, he read my book and liked it, and that's it for me.
Yeah, and if it never goes to air, no one can ever take that away from you.
Right.
You had that experience, and when something like that happens, boy, the world gets extremely small all of a sudden. That this thing that I wrote got noticed by so and so, and it really is mind blowing.
Yeah, it's great. I'm not. There are things that happen where I think, oh, I wish I'd gotten this, or I wish I could sell this book, or but anything I would be tempted to complain about. The former Daryl Gregory would travel through time just to kick my butt for complaining about anything. Because I've already had. All I wanted to do was sell one short story. That's all I wanted to do, and I was going to die happy. And then when you sell one short story, you want to sell a second because you're like, oh, the first one was a fluke. And then you're like, well, I need to sell it to a different editor because they're obviously brain damaged if they're buying my story, my stories. And then you want to sell a novel, and then you want to sell a second novel, and it just keeps going on from there. Garner once told me, he's like, Daryl, it's all ladders. There's no point in the ladder when you're not seeing the rungs ahead of you and you're forgetting about the rungs you climbed. And I'm trying not to forget about those because it's pretty great what I've gotten so far, and I've gotten to write exactly the kind of books I wanted to write, and that's pretty amazing. I'm pretty happy with that.
Well, in your newest work, you're venturing into YA territory, aren't you, with Harrison Squared?
Yeah, that's a whole new thing.
Yeah, tell me about that. How'd that come about?
It came about on a dare. A friend of mine, Bill Willingham,
has lots of good things in life, too.
So many things do. Bill Willingham, who writes Fables, the comic, and is a really good prose writer as well, and a bunch of friends of. He basically dared a bunch of us to write a novel in a month. And it wasn't November, but he was like, we're going to write our own novel. It's January. And the losers, whoever does not write every day and post up their files up to this shared web server, whoever fails at that will have to cook a gourmet meal for the winners. And so I thought, well, I'm a terribly slow writer. I'm going to fail at this, but I decided to start, and I decided, like, I had an editor who said, why don't you write me a mid-grade horror novel? They'd read Raising Stony Mayhall, and they said, there's these sections of him in his childhood that would make a great horror novel. And so I thought, well, I don't really have any ideas for a middle grade or YA horror book. But then we had this challenge, and I thought I could write a middle grade horror book. And so I wrote 45,000 word novel. and I got it done in a month, and it was the fastest I'd ever written anything. I was staying up late at night just to finish this thing, and then it didn't sell, and we shopped it around to a few people, and then at one point Tor said, well, this book, this would make a really good YA novel. Could you make the protagonist older, and could you make it longer? And because they were offering me money, I said, yes, I can. Right. I can do that thing. Which
is always the correct answer.
Yep, exactly, right? And so, but the extra length let me do two things. One, I could go back to the novel and kind of rethink it. And two, it let me write from the monster's point of view. I had these chapters I could have from these kind of Cthulhu cultists and some of the monsters that they were involved with. I gave them their own chapters, and I've always had more sympathy for the monsters than the humans. And I really enjoyed that book. And so I've just signed a contract. I'd always conceived of it. It's the first time I'd ever conceived of a trilogy. So I've got 2 more Harrison books that'll be written for Tor Teen. The first one came out from Tor, and now they're going to redo them as even more traditional YA books for Tor Teen, and I'll do 2 more of those. The first one I've got to start writing. It's due near the beginning of next year, so I got to get going on that.
Well, another question that I was set to ask you has to do with trilogies, but I'll get to that in just a moment. But you alluded to NaNoWriMo a minute ago when you talked about writing a book in a month and being November. So I think most people are familiar with the National Novel Writing Month. What did that do for you for your creative process to be under the gun like that? Was that freeing? Did it allow you to just kind of check out and write? Was it harder? What was your experience with that?
Oh yeah, it was freeing. It was amazingly freeing. It was it made me surrender preciousness, right? So because I had to post up every day, waiting for these files to be uploaded. And it's like you just got to sit down and get it done, and it let me play. I just wrote every day, and I was pantsing it more than I'd ever pantsed before, and it was really fun. Now I ended up with a novel that had some structural problems, but after I finished that month, I went back and rewrote the middle grade, and then, like I said, it didn't sell. It still had some problems, and then rewrote it again later for the YA market. But the experience of writing something in a month, even at that length, was really freeing. It made me get rid of some of my own built-in blocks that I had as a writer about speed and about what it meant to really write. Yeah. And so, I find it really interesting that it changed my process so much.
And it's a lot easier to edit a bad novel than a blank novel.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a lot of pressure in today's publishing market to write trilogies or series? Is there do you get pressure from publishers or from readers that they want to see more of these characters than one book?
Yeah, so there's 2 questions there. It's like, is there pressure from the publishers, and is there pressure from readers? So I've never gotten the pressure from publishers, maybe because I've never had a bestseller. So they've never said, the next thing you have to write is you have to write the next book is trilogy. I've mostly been able to just say, this is my next book, and would you like to publish it, please? And sometimes they say yes. So, but I have had plenty of readers say, oh, could you give us more from that character, or can you give us more in that world? And like I was talking about earlier, for me, a lot of the times the world is tied up with that character. So when the character's story is done, I'm mostly done with everything I've had to say about that world, and I rarely ever have ideas for for trilogies. And Harrison was the first time when I deliberately didn't try to do everything in one book. They were supposed to be short books, and I knew I couldn't do everything in one book, so I wanted to write 3 books to tell the whole story. I do think, I don't know if the pressure from publishers is easing off, because so many series, not every series does that well. The book sales tend to fall off dramatically in book 2 and even more for book 3. That's just the standard linear progression. There's very rarely a book 3 that sells better than a book 1. But I think if that's the story that you need to tell, and in certain genres it's more expected that you write a trilogy. If you're writing epic fantasy, I think there's more of an expectation. But for science fiction novels, not so much.
Fascinating. But as we mentioned in the beginning of the interview, you also write comics. What is the creative process? How does that differ when you're writing a comic? I would think, in my uneducated guessing, that you probably have a stricter structure that you have to work within. You're dealing with pre-existing characters. You're writing a script that then an artist is going to interpret with visuals. How do you approach that?
It's been a fascinating process to learn how to write comics. Coming from being a prose writer, the most important lesson, of course, is you need to write as little as possible. So the script is mostly talking to the artist, because the artist has most of the work to do, and most of the exposition, most of the emotion has to come through the art. You're trying to write as little as possible, and you're setting up the structure of the story so that the artist can tell it visually. And that's been such a challenge and a tremendous amount of fun to learn how to do. Like, the structure is so tight. So these are 22-page comics. The physical act of reading determines how you write it. So if you want a surprise to happen, it has to happen on a page turn. So that means it's happening on even numbered page when you do a surprise. So because, think of page 1 facing you, turn the page, that's page 2, and that's when you see the surprise. It has to end on page 22 or page 20 if you're writing for DC, and that's the end of the comic. And that last page has to lead you on to the next comic, into the next, to tease you, to get you to go to the next issue. And then if you're thinking about trade paperbacks, like saying, well, they're going to collect these 4 or these 6 issues into a trade paperback, that means it has to work in that structure so it feels like a complete story when they get to issue number 6. And that even that issue number 6 should lead you to the next trade paperback. So it's all structure that you're trying to think about. And it's so interesting. And then your other question was like, well, sometimes you're dealing with characters that have already been created. Some of the comics I've written, they're like I wrote Planet of the Apes for a few years, and they said you can do anything in the Apes universe, in the classic Apes universe, the one I grew up in, that you want to, and so I could make up all new characters and do whatever I wanted, but it was still within the confines of the Apes universe. I just wrote a Green Hornet comic, and obviously there you're dealing with Green Hornet and Kato, and those are characters that I don't own, but I absolutely feel like when I'm writing that book, I own them for those 22 pages. They're my characters, and I'm trying to make them work as well as possible. So it's been amazing. As a comic book geek, I was just so excited to get the opportunity to be able to write comics every once in a while, just because it's such a different thing and because I love them so much.
Do you ever find that structure crippling? I've got to dream up a story, but not only do I have to dream up a story, but it has to hit certain beats at certain times, and I have to create cliffhangers that all work together in just the right way. Is that just? I think for a lot of people, they just throw their hands up and go, "Nope, not going to do it. I'm gonna go write a sci-fi short story."
But you come in knowing that's the deal. So you don't come into the tennis court and saying, "What do you mean I got to stay within these white lines? Why is there a net?" That is the deal you take when you start to write. So you give your brain this assignment. Your brain knows that those are the parameters. So it throws out any ideas that don't fit in those parameters. And you get to a certain point, if you've written a few comics, that when it's comic book time, you start thinking in terms of comics. What's going to work in a comic? I don't get novel ideas when I'm working on a comic. I don't get short story ideas when I'm working on a novel. You sort of tell your brain what size you need to work on, and that's the size of ideas that come about. And it's kind of freaky how, like when I was writing a novella, like when I was writing We're All Completely Fine, that's a novella. It had to be under 39,000 words, and it came in at 38,000. And it was freaky how you're just sort of shaping things to fit that size bag of story. Like, you got a 5-pound bag of story, you're going to make 5 pounds of it. I don't know how it works, but it's weird.
That is freakishly true. I just turned in a short story for an anthology, and it came in within 50 words of the target word count. And in the beginning, I never could have planned that, but you're right. That's freaky how that works. It's crazy. How do you break into comics? I think a lot of people kind of think that this is that there's this kind of odd fraternity of people that write comics, and it's how if someone was interested in doing that, how would you even go about getting in that exclusive club?
I don't know, man. It's so hard. It's so hard to break into comics. So the way I broke in was I was friends with these people who wrote comics. So I was friends with Bill Willingham, and I was friends with Chris Robertson, who's a great prose writer, but also was doing comics. And Matt Sturgis. I met all these people, and all I did was express my extreme jealousy that they were writing comics. And Chris recommended me to Boom Studios to write a comic with Kurt Busiek called Dracula, the Company of Monsters, and that was my first comic. And I was writing Planet of the Apes. And that's the way I got in, was through friends. Like I'm resentful of that, in that at least with short stories, there's a slush pile. There's a way for an outsider to get in. With comics, I don't know of a way to get in. Well, there's two ways to get in. One is somehow you get to know people and you get lucky, and you've written enough other stuff that they think for some reason that you can write comics too. That's one way. So I wrote for 20 years writing science fiction before I was offered a comic. The other way to do it, and this is really the smarter way to go about it, is the best way to break into comics is to start making comics. To go on the web, to find an artist, or if you can draw them yourselves, and start making comics. And that's the way to break in. And but it's so much more difficult of a field to break into than prose. So I don't lobby for comics jobs that much. I mostly write prose because I have control over that.
Right, and that's a great point. Is we're in a great time for writers and for publishing now, and you really do have control. So and with the internet, if you really are interested in comics, like you said, that there's been countless people that have started web comics and gotten noticed, and
exactly.
So that's great. Daryl, this has been a fascinating hour, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But we're running out of time. Where can people find you, and where can they connect with your work and talk with you and give you feedback?
Oh yeah, I'm a really open writer, so feel free to hit me up anywhere you want. I'm at my website's darylgregory.com. I'm on Twitter as Daryl Writer Guy because Daryl Gregory got taken. And I know, right?
Man,
Daryl.
Dang it, Daryl.
Yeah, and so my email address is up there. I'm really easy to contact, but yeah, follow me on there and come talk to me at a bar near a con near you.
Awesome, will do, and we'll put links in the show notes to your website and to all of your work. Daryl, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the show.
Thanks so much, Hank. I really appreciate it.